In a galaxy torn by war and betrayal, Elias Carter, once known as the ruthless assassin John Wick, has sought refuge in diplomacy, determined to leave his violent past behind. But when he's invited to mediate peace between two alien factions, he soon finds himself trapped in a web of espionage, betrayal, and dark secrets. As the ghosts of his past resurface, Elias must confront the man responsible for the murder of his wife and make an impossible choice: seek revenge and risk everything, or sacrifice himself to bring peace to a broken galaxy. Elias Carter, once known throughout the galaxy as John Wick, carried with him a dark and violent past. His earlier life was defined by bloodshed, betrayal, and personal loss, making him a feared figure across the universe. John Wick was not just a name, it was a legend, known for his unparalleled combat skills and relentless pursuit of vengeance. He had become a symbol of ruthlessness and terror. His life had been shaped by the tragic death of his wife, a loss that drove him deeper into a world of violence, where every action was motivated by revenge. The pain of losing his wife, combined with a series of betrayals from those he trusted, pushed Elias to become a man who lived only for the pursuit of vengeance. His enemies feared him, and his friends feared what he had become. But after years of endless conflict and loss, Elias reached a breaking point. He realized that this cycle of violence was not bringing him peace or satisfaction, only more suffering. The memory of his wife haunted him, and he knew that continuing down the path of vengeance would only destroy him further. In an attempt to escape the cycle of violence and find a new purpose, Elias made a drastic decision. He abandoned his identity as John Wick and adopted a new path, one of diplomacy. Seeking redemption, he hoped that by helping mediate peace between different factions in the galaxy, he could atone for the blood he had shed and find a new sense of purpose. This was not just an external change. It was a personal transformation, one where Elias sought to leave behind the darkness that had consumed him for so long. He hoped that by walking away from the violence, he could finally heal and find a semblance of peace. Yet, as he would soon learn, the past is never so easily left behind. When Elias Carter assumed his new role as a diplomat, the galaxy had no idea that the man standing before them, whom they now viewed as a symbol of peace, was once the infamous John Wick. To the people and the governing powers of the galaxy, Elias was simply a fresh face among the political elite, a well-educated, calm individual representing human interests in the complex web of galactic diplomacy. His reputation as a skilled negotiator and his ability to maintain a level-headed demeanor in tense situations made him an ideal candidate for peacekeeping roles. Little did they know, the man they now relied on for diplomacy had a blood-soaked past, one that included countless lives lost in his pursuit of vengeance. Elias had hoped that this new path would allow him to escape his violent legacy. The transition from a feared assassin to a peacemaker was not an easy one, but it was necessary. He saw this as a way to redeem himself, to reshape his identity and prove to himself that he could be more than the man he once was. The galaxy, however, was unaware of the weight Elias carried with him, the endless nightmares of bloodshed, loss, and betrayal. While the galaxy saw a diplomatic envoy, Elias saw himself as a man still struggling with the darkness inside. For the factions he would mediate between, Elias appeared to be the perfect choice, someone who could offer a new perspective and possibly even an outside solution to long-standing conflicts. But beneath the surface, the human diplomat remained deeply scarred by the violent past he had tried so hard to leave behind. The fear that John Wick once instilled in others had not yet disappeared. It simply lay dormant within Elias, hidden from public view. The galaxy had no idea that they were placing their hopes for peace in the hands of a man who had once been a terror across the stars. Elias Carter's new life as a diplomat soon took an unexpected turn when the Galactic Empire, a vast and authoritarian regime, extended an invitation for him to mediate a peace summit between two alien factions embroiled in a century-long war. This invitation was an important step in Elias's new career and opportunity to prove his worth as a negotiator and diplomat. The Empire, known for its immense power and political influence, saw potential in Elias, perhaps because of his outsider status and his reputation for being level-headed. The factions involved in the war were divided by deep-rooted hostilities, and the Empire believed that Elias's unique position as an experienced mediator could offer a fresh approach to ending the conflict. On the surface, the task was simple enough. Elias was to mediate between the two alien factions, guiding them toward a lasting peace. However, despite the seemingly straightforward nature of the assignment, Elias knew that the reality of diplomatic negotiations was far more complex. The Galactic Empire, with its vast political ambitions, had its own motives, and Elias understood that peace could only be achieved if both sides had a vested interest in the outcome. Diplomacy, in this case, was as much about power plays, hidden agendas, and manipulation as it was about finding common ground. Elias had seen enough of the galaxy's darker side to recognize that this was not a mission of pure goodwill. Moreover, the summit was not just about two alien factions. It was a chess game played on a much larger scale. The Empire had its own political agenda, and the factions involved were not only seeking peace, but also trying to outmaneuver each other to gain more influence in the galaxy. Elias, despite his desire for peace, was now drawn into the larger web of galactic politics, where every decision carried significant consequences. The Empire's invitation, while framed as an opportunity for peace, was also a move to secure its own power and control over the region. Elias found himself not only mediating peace, but also navigating a political landscape fraught with manipulation, power struggles, and suspicion. As Elias prepared for the summit, he could sense the storm brewing inside him. Though he had chosen diplomacy, the old instincts of John Wick, the assassin driven by vengeance and survival, still lurked beneath the surface. The weight of his past and the pressure of his new role clashed, creating an internal turmoil that would only intensify as the summit approached. Elias knew this mission would test his resolve like never before, and the path to peace was far from clear. As Elias Carter stood at the forefront of galactic diplomacy, he found that his calm, diplomatic exterior barely masked the internal struggle that raged inside him. His past as John Wick, the notorious assassin, was never far from his mind. The memories of his wife's tragic death, the catalyst that had thrust him into a life of violence and vengeance, haunted him relentlessly. These dark recollections would surface at the most inopportune moments, and the echoes of that brutal life reminded him of the man he had been, and feared he might still become. On the surface, Elias appeared to be a man transformed, no longer the cold, calculating killer who once hunted down his enemies with ruthless efficiency. But beneath his composed demeanor, the emotional scars from his past were deep, raw, and unresolved. While he had chosen the path of diplomacy, he was not immune to the anger and pain that still simmered within him. His desire for peace, for a life where he could move beyond the bloodshed, was genuine, but it was constantly at odds with the violent impulses that had once defined him. The negotiations he engaged in as a diplomat often felt like a thin veil over the chaos that lingered just beneath the surface. As Elias mediated between factions, trying to navigate the complexities of political alliances and fragile peace treaties, his thoughts would drift back to the darker days of his past. He couldn't escape the faces of those he'd killed, the lives he'd destroyed in his quest for vengeance. There was a part of him that wondered if he could ever truly leave that life behind, or if it was simply too deeply ingrained in him to escape. The ghosts of his past were not easy to silence, and every time he made a concession or a peace offering, he felt as though he was betraying the violent man he had once been. At the same time, Elias was tormented by his own moral conflict. Was his pursuit of diplomacy truly an effort for redemption, or was it simply a way to mask the guilt and shame that came with the violence of his past? He often questioned whether he could ever achieve true redemption. Could a man who had caused so much destruction ever really become a force for peace? The pressure of this internal battle weighed heavily on him, making every decision more difficult as he struggled to reconcile his desire for peace with the rage that had once consumed him. Ultimately, Elias knew that his journey as a diplomat was not just about mediating conflicts between alien factions. It was a personal journey, one in which he sought to find meaning and healing after a lifetime of loss and destruction. However, no matter how hard he tried, the shadow of John Wick loomed large, and the peace he so desperately sought remained just out of reach. As Elias Carter's diplomatic mission progressed, it didn't take long for his presence to raise suspicions within the Galactic Empire, a regime built on surveillance, control, and secrecy. The Empire, with its authoritarian structure, had little tolerance for anyone who might disrupt its tightly woven web of power. Elias, despite his calm demeanor and diplomatic expertise, was perceived as an outsider, an unknown variable who could either be a valuable asset or a potential threat. The Empire's leaders, particularly those with their own political agendas, began to view him with increasing wariness. Whispers of espionage and covert operations began to circulate, and Elias found himself entangled in a dangerous game of suspicion, mistrust, and intrigue. The Empire, known for its ruthlessness, was accustomed to controlling everything and everyone around it. The arrival of an outsider like Elias, someone with no apparent loyalty to the Empire and who carried with him an air of authority and competence, was unsettling. His calm, measured approach to diplomacy only heightened the Empire's wariness. In the Empire's eyes, anyone with such poise and calculated confidence could easily be hiding a far more dangerous agenda. The possibility that Elias was not the peaceful mediator he appeared to be, but instead a spy or a hidden threat, was a thought that quickly gained traction. General Kalen, a high-ranking officer within the Empire and one with his own ambitions, was especially suspicious of Elias. Kalen had a sharp mind and a keen sense of when things didn't add up, and he instinctively saw Elias as a person who could pose a challenge to the Empire's carefully constructed authority. Elias's ability to remain composed in tense situations, his authoritative presence, and his apparent neutrality in the ongoing political struggles were all seen as red flags. To Kalen, Elias's very presence seemed to undermine the control the Empire exerted over its subjects and allies. He viewed Elias not as a mediator, but as an obstacle to his own rise in power. Soon, these growing suspicions took a darker turn. As tensions mounted during the ongoing summit negotiations, a sense of impending danger began to envelop Elias. His every move, every word, came under close scrutiny. The Empire's intelligence network started to dig deeper into his background, seeking to uncover any potential connection to foreign powers or resistance movements. The once promising mission of diplomacy quickly morphed into a scenario where Elias found himself not only trying to broker peace, but also trying to prove his innocence and survive the growing distrust of those in power. The more Elias tried to maintain his neutrality and focus on peace, the more the Empire tightened its grip around him. This shift from being a respected diplomat to being viewed as a possible traitor was a painful realization for Elias. His past, once carefully hidden beneath the surface, was now coming back to haunt him in the most unexpected way. It was no longer just the alien factions that saw him as a potential threat, but the very empire he had hoped to help. As suspicion mounted, Elias realized that his diplomatic mission had become far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. He was now caught in a web of political intrigue with no clear way out. The stakes had risen exponentially, and Elias was forced to confront not only the challenges of diplomacy, but also the growing conspiracy surrounding him. As the political tension around Elias Carter escalated, his fears of being caught in the crosshairs of the Empire's suspicious gaze became a grim reality. After a particularly tense negotiation session, in which Elias worked to mediate between the two alien factions, the Empire's distrust reached its boiling point. General Kalen, whose suspicion of Elias had only grown, finally acted. Elias was apprehended by Imperial guards on fabricated charges of espionage, accused of secretly working for foreign powers to undermine the Empire's authority. Despite having no real evidence to support these accusations, the Empire swiftly moved against Elias, showing no hesitation in arresting him. The arrest was swift and brutal. Elias, who had prided himself on being a man of peace, found himself trapped in a situation he could not escape. His years of experience navigating dangerous political landscapes had taught him how to survive in tense environments, but this was something entirely different. He had been wrongfully accused, thrown into a high-security prison, and stripped of his freedom, all based on a lie. The very regime he had hoped to broker peace with had turned on him, and the diplomatic facade he had so carefully built was now crumbling. The prison, located on a desolate and isolated moon far from the bustling centers of galactic power, became Elias's new reality. It was here, in the cold shadows of a high-security facility, that he was forced to confront the depths of his own internal struggle. The quiet and isolation allowed him to reflect on his past decisions, the sacrifices he had made, and the dark forces that had shaped his life. His imprisonment was a cruel irony, a diplomat caught by the very empire he had been sent to negotiate with. The walls of the prison mirrored the walls Elias had built around his heart after the death of his wife, both imprisoning him in a cycle of grief, regret, and a desperate search for meaning. As Elias sat in his cell, unable to do anything but wait, the weight of his situation pressed down on him. The years he had spent running from his past, trying to build a new identity, had led him to this point, trapped in a prison cell, accused of being a traitor. His thoughts often drifted back to his wife, whose death had triggered his descent into violence. Was this how it would end for him? Would he die as a pawn in a political game, the very thing he had fought to escape? The question of whether the sacrifices he had made for peace were worth anything at all lingered in his mind, unanswered. The prison became more than just a physical confinement. It was a place where Elias was forced to reckon with his past, the choices he had made, and the person he had become. His hopes of finding peace through diplomacy now seemed like a distant dream, a dream shattered by the Empire's betrayal. The walls of his cell represented not just the Empire's control over him, but the emotional and psychological prison he had built for himself in the wake of his past. Trapped in a situation he never expected, Elias's internal battle between his past and present reached a breaking point. The path forward, if there was one, seemed uncertain. In the oppressive silence of the high-security prison, Elias Carter was not alone. Though his cell was isolated and surrounded by the desolate expanse of the moon, a fellow prisoner, Era, shared his fate. Unlike Elias, Era was a mysterious figure, someone whose background was as enigmatic as her intentions. At first, Elias paid little attention to her. His mind was consumed by his own situation, the loss of his wife, and the betrayal he had faced at the hands of the Empire. But Era's presence would soon become pivotal in the unfolding events that would alter the course of Elias's journey. Era was unlike anyone Elias had encountered before. While he had grown accustomed to deception and manipulation, there was something about her that intrigued him. She exuded a quiet strength, a sense of purpose that seemed at odds with the grim setting of their shared prison. She didn't seem like an ordinary prisoner. There was something deliberate in the way she carried herself, as though she was playing her own game, one that had not yet been revealed. Era had heard of Elias Carter, or more specifically, of John Wick, the name that still haunted the galaxy's most feared corners. She knew of his violent past, of the legend that had grown around him, and she saw something in him that the others did not: potential. One day, Era finally spoke to Elias, and her voice, cold yet oddly sympathetic, broke the silence of the prison. "I know who you are," she said, her words carrying weight. "And I need you." Her cryptic statement caught Elias off guard. He had grown used to keeping his distance from others, especially after years of betrayal. Trusting anyone had become nearly impossible for him. But Era was different. She was not offering him false hope or promises of a better future. Instead, she laid out a proposition, one that both intrigued and unnerved him. She needed his help to take down General Kalen, the man who had played a major role in the Empire's oppressive regime and, as Elias would soon learn, the man responsible for many of his own suffering and loss. Era's plan was straightforward in its complexity. She wanted to use Elias's skill set, his experience with violence, and his past as John Wick to target General Kalen, who had become a powerful figure within the Empire. To Elias, this was a tempting proposition. Kalen was not just a political figure to be dealt with. He was a man who represented the very forces that had kept him imprisoned and betrayed him. The idea of confronting Kalen, of finally having the opportunity to bring the man responsible for so much pain to justice, stirred something deep within him. The thought of revenge, long buried beneath his diplomatic aspirations, began to resurface. However, Elias's instincts screamed at him to be cautious. Over the years, he had learned the hard way not to trust anyone easily. Era's proposals seemed too calculated, too convenient. She knew too much about him, and her motivations were unclear. Though Elias was drawn to the idea of taking down Kalen, part of him couldn't shake the suspicion that Era, too, had her own hidden agenda. He had been betrayed before, and the thought of putting his trust in someone else only to be deceived again weighed heavily on him. But the temptation to confront Kalen, to act on the rage and grief that had defined so much of his life, proved too strong. Era's presence in the prison began to serve as both a temptation and a warning. She was the catalyst that could push Elias back toward the violence he had tried so hard to escape, and yet, her offer was also a possible pathway to a form of justice he had long denied himself. The conflict within Elias deepened. Could he trust her, or was this just another deception, another betrayal in the making? Despite the doubts, Elias found himself reluctantly drawn into her web. As Elias Carter became further entangled in the plot devised by Era, his sense of caution grew, yet the pull of revenge was too strong to ignore. He had agreed to help her bring down General Kalen, the very man who had caused so much pain in his life. Together, they began to unravel a series of dark secrets about the Empire and Kalen's true intentions, secrets that were far deeper and more dangerous than Elias had initially anticipated. With each passing day, they gathered intelligence, formulated plans, and started to understand the extent of Kalen's power within the Empire. The situation, once appearing like a straightforward revenge mission, began to take on layers of complexity and danger that Elias had not fully anticipated. However, Elias's worst fears were soon realized when the truth about Era's intentions began to surface. What had seemed like an unlikely partnership quickly revealed itself to be a carefully orchestrated deception. In a devastating twist, it became clear that Era had been manipulating Elias from the very beginning. She was not the ally she appeared to be. In fact, she had been working for General Kalen all along. The revelation came as a crushing blow to Elias, a man who had long carried the burden of betrayal in his heart. He had allowed himself to trust Era, to believe that she shared his goals, only to find that she had been playing him for her own purposes. The betrayal cut deeper than Elias could have imagined. It wasn't just that Era had deceived him. It was the realization that, once again, his attempts to trust had led him into a trap. The very instincts he had honed during his time as John Wick had warned him about this possibility, but he had let his desire for revenge cloud his judgment. Era had exploited that desire, using it to manipulate him into furthering her own agenda, which was ultimately tied to Kalen's power. The pain of betrayal was compounded by the fact that he had fallen for it, and it forced Elias to confront the truth about himself. His desire for vengeance had blinded him to the manipulations around him. This revelation shattered the fragile trust that Elias had managed to build, not just with Era, but with his own sense of self. The lines between allies and enemies became completely blurred. Era's actions made Elias question everything. Was his pursuit of justice just another form of manipulation? Was his desire for vengeance the only thing keeping him moving forward? The trust he had placed in people was now irreparably broken. Elias had already paid a steep price for trusting others in the past, and Era's betrayal only reaffirmed the deep, unhealable scars left by years of loss and deception. The emotional toll of this betrayal was immense, and it left Elias at a crossroads. Now he had to deal with the consequences of his choices, the realization that he had been played, and the harsh truth that Kalen's influence extended much further than Elias could have imagined. The manipulation of Era was just a small part of a much larger, more dangerous game being played by Kalen. Elias was no longer just fighting for revenge. He was fighting for his very survival, with trust and alliances no longer providing him with the clarity he once sought. The lines had blurred so much that Elias could no longer distinguish between the truth and the lies, between those who sought peace and those who reveled in power. The mission that had once seemed like an opportunity for redemption now felt like a no-win situation, with Elias caught in a web of betrayal, deceit, and moral ambiguity. The shocking truth about Era's betrayal was not the only revelation that rocked Elias to his core. As he pieced together the deeper layers of intrigue and conspiracy surrounding General Kalen, he uncovered a truth far more devastating than any deception he had encountered before. General Kalen was directly responsible for the murder of his wife. This truth shattered Elias's already fragile emotional state, dragging him back to a place of intense grief and rage that he had desperately tried to escape. For years, Elias had buried the pain of his wife's death, channeling it into his relentless pursuit of vengeance as John Wick. His life had been defined by a single, tragic event: the loss of the woman he loved, a loss that had turned him into a weapon of destruction. Over time, he had convinced himself that the violence he had unleashed was a form of justice, a way to deal with the grief that consumed him. But the revelation that Kalen had orchestrated her murder brought a sharp clarity to his mind. The very man he had been working against, the one he had sought to bring down, had not just been a figure of oppression in the galaxy. He had personally destroyed Elias's life, setting the stage for everything that had followed. The betrayal of Era now felt like a mere footnote in comparison to the devastating impact of this new truth. The depth of Elias's rage was overwhelming. He had always known, in some distant corner of his mind, that the pain of losing his wife would never truly leave him. Yet, this new knowledge brought everything back to the surface with an intensity that was almost unbearable. The grief, the anger, the unresolved questions, it all came flooding back. He had fought so hard to create a new life for himself, to escape the bloodshed and violence that had defined his past. But now, with the truth about Kalen, all of that seemed like a distant illusion. Elias had never truly escaped his past. It had simply been lying in wait, ready to consume him once again. This moment of revelation was also a turning point for Elias. The path of vengeance he had been on was now undeniable. For years, he had tried to run from it, to convince himself that diplomacy and peace were the answers, but the reality of Kalen's actions forced him to confront the truth. Peace was an illusion, and redemption could only come through justice. His journey, which had once been about mediation and negotiation, was now irrevocably about revenge. The violence he had tried to escape was now his only recourse. The man who had once sought peace now stood at the precipice of becoming the very thing he had feared most: John Wick. The emotional and psychological toll of this discovery was immense. Elias was now driven not just by the desire to stop a ruthless general, but by the need for closure, the need to finally bring justice to the man who had torn his world apart. Kalen was no longer just an obstacle to peace. He was the embodiment of everything Elias had lost. The quest for vengeance, once something Elias had avoided, was now a burning necessity, an all-consuming force that threatened to take over his entire being. The loss of his wife had once sent him spiraling into a violent existence, but now, with Kalen's involvement in her death, that cycle of violence seemed inevitable. The world around him had become a place where the only way to truly confront the pain was to destroy the source of it, Kalen. As the confrontation with General Kalen loomed closer, Elias Carter found himself in the midst of a moral and emotional crisis. The final days leading up to the inevitable clash with Kalen were filled with doubt and tension. Elias, no longer the man he once was consumed by his desire for vengeance. His transformation from the man of peace and diplomacy he had tried so hard to become to the ruthless, vengeful figure of his past was now complete. The violence that had once defined him as John Wick resurfaced in full force. However, despite the anger and pain that drove him, a deeper part of Elias understood that his journey was no longer just about vengeance. It was about something much larger. Elias's rage, while intense, became intertwined with a realization that peace could not come through violence alone. This understanding emerged as he prepared to confront Kalen, an understanding that, despite all the bloodshed and suffering, the galaxy needed peace. Elias's desire for revenge was matched by a growing awareness that in order to stop the cycle of violence, something greater was required. It wasn't just about defeating Kalen. It was about ending the endless bloodshed that had cost him everything. And in that moment of clarity, Elias came to a heart-wrenching conclusion. To stop Kalen and end the war, he would have to sacrifice himself. The path to redemption that Elias sought was not one that could be achieved through force or hatred. His life had been marked by loss, by the destruction of everything he loved, and by his transformation into a weapon of vengeance. Yet, through this painful journey, he came to understand that true redemption came not through further destruction, but through selflessness and sacrifice. He realized that in order to ensure peace, he had to lay down the sword that had defined him for so long. The ultimate sacrifice would be his. He would have to die in order to stop the war, to stop Kalen, and to give the galaxy the peace it desperately needed. This decision was not one Elias made lightly. The emotional and psychological weight of it was almost unbearable. To give up his life after everything he had been through, after the death of his wife, after the years of violence and suffering, and after the betrayals he had faced, was a monumental choice. Yet, Elias knew that in this moment, he had the power to bring an end to the chaos. His death would be the final act of resistance, the only way to ensure that the legacy of violence and revenge that had consumed him for so long would die with him. In choosing to sacrifice himself, Elias not only sought redemption for his own soul, but also offered the galaxy a chance at a future free from the cycles of bloodshed that had defined it. The peace that Elias fought for came at a terrible cost. His death was the price that had to be paid to stop Kalen's war and to end the Empire's reign of terror. The galaxy would remember Elias Carter not just as the former diplomat, not just as John Wick, but as a hero and a martyr. His ultimate sacrifice became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there could be a way to bring light. The galaxy would remember him not for the blood on his hands, but for the peace his death ensured. Elias's story would live on as a lesson in the true cost of redemption, the price of vengeance, and the ultimate sacrifice needed to protect those you love. His life, once defined by violence and revenge, was transformed into a legacy of hope, a legacy that proved that, even in the most hopeless of circumstances, a single act of selflessness could change everything.